So I'm going to be talking about reproducible education. And when I use reproducibility in this sense, I have a lot of different senses. I think about Jupyter in kind of a different way because I use it in kind of a different way. My first training was really sort of in the open science world, and so I use that philosophy in how I organize my educational artifacts. So I'm going to be talking a lot about what we as educators can learn from open science practices and open source practices. Phone is on my arrow key. Hold on, there we are. Okay. So to give you context, because I think I teach maybe a different population than what you all might be doing. I'm also like suddenly intimidated by the audience in this room. So who are my students? So I teach at the School of Information Sciences at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. We are not in the CS department. I am very literally on the wrong side of campus for them. The vast majority of my students are Masters of Library and Information Science students. Of those students, 95% of them would be considered what you might call pure humanities, so English, literature. Most of them have never even seen HTML before. So this is what I teach them. In terms of the context for this class, it is foundational programming in Python. Now, the MS in Information Management students, that's a newer program, so there's fewer students. Most of them come into the program already knowing how to code, so I get the few who don't. They are there as sort of, they're data science track students, and so they're taking my class as kind of a pre-data science program. And then I have sort of scattered students from other departments. My class is a grad level class, so I get doctoral students from other areas who need that CS 101, but for research purposes. Our classes are pretty small, about two rows of these little hearts is about one section. You'll also note that I have taught most of my students online, and I actually prefer teaching in the online version. We have synchronous sessions, and I run my online synchronous session exactly the same as I run my on-campus session. I use the same materials. I change my prompts a little. I say, like, type in the chat box instead of raising your hand, but otherwise, everything's exactly the same. I prefer that, and I would love to talk to you more about that, but that's not the focus of this talk. I was given a choice for this fall, on campus or online, and I chose online because I love the online students and working with them. How I use Jupyter, I'm not going to cover all of these, but Jupyter might not be the first thing that the students see in class, but Jupyter is everywhere in my class, and I could not do my class without Jupyter. So my class, to give you broader context, so a 16-week semester. First week and last week are the only classes I have slides. Everything else, every 14 weeks in the middle of that, everything is live coded. There are no slides whatsoever. Everything is live coding. So in the class, I write all of my own material. I don't use anything from we have a textbook, but nothing comes from the book. Everything comes just from me because you can't find a programming book for library students for humanities. It just doesn't exist. It existed in the 1970s, but apparently we can't have nice things anymore. So I don't know why. But yeah, I work out examples that map to the homework. I use several labels. I try to use the best practices that I can. There's a lot of education jargon in here. But I can't say everything is pretty normative jargon for the education community, so if you're looking stuff up later. I do want to talk a little bit more about the last two. So everything that I make is up on GitHub. All of these lectures are written in Jupyter, and they are all public on GitHub for students. I have a strong focus of having students have their own installations for this because many of my students are graduating or doing this as like a one-off class because they're working professionals and they need it for their job. And it's really important for me that they have a Python they can take home with them. Also, I have no resources. So I do not have a postdoc. I do not have, the TAs that I have are there for grading, not for like spin up a server for me, right? I am just me, and I have no money either. So I don't do any fancy things. My goal of this talk is to argue that Jupyter, what did I step on? Okay. Allows educational content to be stored in really common open source workflow tools, which means we can use those workflow tools to migrate other content in which makes it a better, which I also argue is a better place to store those materials. So like having an 11-page syllabus in Markdown instead of an 11-page PDF, for example. Reproducibility means much more than just forking the repo, right? If you attended the like why I hate notebooks talk earlier, yeah, it's more than just can I download it, can I access it? It's like, can I actually make anything run on my machine? My argument about Jupyter is that it is a write once, teach anywhere kind of technical writing platform. And that's how I treat it. And I'm going to be unpacking that statement in later slides. So the problem. Right, so what's my problem, my solution? The problem is slide decks and other educational artifacts that we create along the way. So slide decks are irreproducible education, right? Who has been ever just handed a slide deck? And they were like, you're cool now, right? And you're like, yeah, I can be. That's the nature of this relationship. The problem with slide decks is that they're really difficult to carry the context through, right? You all know, who has been to a conference where someone was reading a 5-page paper to you, and you're like, ooh, nap time, this is fun. They're also really annoying to teach from if you're doing a live demo because you're escaping and you're alt-tabbing, and then I'm just getting like really mad and the students are like, this screen is exploding in front of me and I can't take notes because what am I looking at anymore? And they're not enough to write a full narrative. Like, if someone can give me a single slide in 32-point font that accurately explains a for loop to a student who's never used a for loop before, would like that single slide, right? For loops require paragraphs to explain and time to explain. Now, slides are just not meant for these activities. So we shouldn't be treating them as like my course as represented in slide decks. And yet, they're these academic commodity. Like, I'm being asked to deposit my slide decks for this talk, as if that is representative of the content that I am speaking to you about. Separating code from examples really makes it really hard to piece content back together on the fly as you're presenting as well. Collaboration is rough. Now, I don't want to say I know what reproducible education looks like, right? I don't know what that end game is, but I think that's a place you can start heading towards. So what happens when you have an open science person, me, who is handed a bunch of slide decks and said, make it work, kid? That was me a couple of years ago. Slides, right? Now, I understand the meta context that I am putting this slide about slides in a slide deck and presenting to you with it. So there's a certain amount of rage, like, please don't give me a slide deck for code. No, we're not just frustrated at this. We're frustrated with very clear explanations as to why we're frustrated and how to fix the problem, which is the worst way to be frustrated. It's the hardest way to be frustrated. It's easier if you can just say, like, I'm mad and I don't know why, right? Because open science is a really infectious philosophy. We don't just want to like make our data set out in the wild so other people can check our p-values. It's so much more than that. And once you start adopting it, it becomes so much more than that in your professional life. We want all of the data to be open and public. We want the code to be reusable. We want our publications to be open access. We want all of the research artifacts that we're making to be preservable over the course of our career and reusable for us in 20 years and 3 institutions later, and reusable for the students that we're going to teach in 20 years who are probably not born yet at that point. Now, I just want to take a moment. Respect your IRB and human subjects' privacy. Don't publish human subject data, please. And do not give crap to people who can't publish their data, because sensitive data is real, and can we all be respectful of each other for a moment? And yeah, okay, tangent over. So we all, open science people all eventually have to teach something, right? But we can't turn off this perspective. Okay, so I'm gonna do a quick question here. You can only answer once. Who here is like an educator, right? Like you have lecturer or professor in your job title. Okay, hands down. Remember, you can only answer one. Who here has trainer or training or teach in your job description somewhere? All right, cool, hands down. Who's ever been thrown an intern that you had to train up? Okay, hands down. Who didn't raise their hand to any of those? You teach, you've done workshops. Oh, that's true, but like, okay, no, that's a really good point. I did not design a good multiple choice question there. It was not, it was mutually exclusive, but not complete. So we all have to train and teach at some point. And if you follow open science practices or open source practices, like, you can't just turn off that philosophy of put it all on GitHub because you want to. You want your workshop content to be public. You want your talks to be shared and open. You want your course materials to be open and usable and interesting to everyone. You want that content not just to be viewable, but nice looking, so people want to look at it, right? And you desperately want to use the organizational tools that you've already gotten used to in your own workflows. Now, there's always exceptions. Not everyone wants to, right? I have a massive, I don't know how I feel about OER, because if I have to pay for babysitting to write materials, I would like some money. That's really hard for me. I'm still juggling with my own viewpoints on that. So there's always, I do make everything I can public, but there's always exceptions to these things. So context for my approach and how I sort of run the materials for my class. I wanted to do something better than the slide decks I was given. It was like in an emergency basis, so everything's kind of forgivable. But I am the sole technical support for my students. If I make them do something that's something other than like logging into your email, it's on me to help them. And I usually carry like between 50 and 60 students a semester. And I need to maintain the classroom standards for my lecture. I hold myself to extremely high standards for the quality content that I present and have my students do, because I know the horror stories that they have been through before. I also strongly want to keep my students in their own comfort zone, because I want to keep novelty to what is only necessary, right? I want to use as much as supported by others as possible. And again, I'm my own support as well. I don't have a buddy next door who can help me with DevOps stuff. If I can't do it, it can't be done for me. Like, I am my own support person. So, for example, I could spin up my own LMS and support everything in a beautiful way, or I could use the one that is supported by the 8 people in my building whose sole job it is to make that thing work and help me with it. So I pick my battles because I only have so much bandwidth. I also hate making anything simple turn into a 15-minute process. So for example, updating my syllabus in that old PDF form in the LMS involved tracking down the Word file on my computer, making an edit, dumping that out to a PDF, going into my LMS, uploading it, and deleting the old version. Like a 2-step process. I can't just like update a file. I also have a strong aversion to following bleeding edge tools because of all of the above, right? Things move underfoot all the time, and I don't have a whole lot of time to update materials. Even just like over the spring and summer, Anaconda and PyCharm tweaking how you install things and change stuff, that's like 20 hours of human labor for me and my TAs to test that across all of the different kinds of machines and get everything updated, get all the screenshots updated. Just that small tweak has a massive amount of labor. So as things are updated and change, or the community shifts away from something, I'm on the hook to keep those materials up to date. And I just simply don't have the bandwidth. So it's not because I think that the thing isn't cool. It's certainly cool, but like, I cannot deal. I like to refer to Jupyter as a fussless glue for writing lessons. So I cannot imagine writing what I do without Jupyter. I cannot imagine teaching without Jupyter, even though I don't actually teach with Jupyter in the classroom. So the caveat here, this is for writing. I have novices, the purest novices you can imagine. Never seen code before, never written code before. I had to take 20 minutes to explain what I mean by script here, kind of novices. So I don't think for them Jupyter is appropriate as a first platform on day one. How can I get rid of the fuss? Right? I hate fussy things. And I say this as someone who types in Dvorak on an Ergodox keyboard. But that's for accessibility reasons, right? Like, there's a feature, I have a feature need that keyboard and that layout solves, right? To So lectures, what do lectures have? They have human words, they have code, they have images and memes sometimes, rarely a table. Splitting up the human words and code as you're writing and developing makes it really hard to retain those contextual connections. Like I've tried writing just in Markdown, but like coding in one thing and writing in another makes it really hard to go back and forth and constantly be copying and pasting because I can't test as I'm going, as I'm writing. Writing in one program and coding in another just strongly breaks my focus. But enter Jupyter, right? I can keep it all in one. To me, it's an all-in-one environment. I can write, I can code, I can test that code, and I can format it all in one window. For example, if I was writing a short lecture, I work out the big example that we want to be going through in class. So like, I'll just open up a notebook and I have a special key mapped to Shift Enter, so I'm just like whacking on that for a while to getting a bunch of blank cells. I'll use that bottom chunk of the notebook to fully develop out this short piece of code that we want to put together. And then I'll go back to the top and describe how I did it, and eventually meeting myself at the end, right? My focus stays on track. Because if I realize, oh, I forgot to talk about that, or oh, I'm missing that, I can go back up, update the code, update the words, and go back up to the top of the notebook, kill the kernel, and run all the way through, again, with my Shift-Enter button, and check that I haven't broken things along the way, and that everything still makes sense. And I do find things that I missed, right? Because you can eat your own tail very easily in Jupyter, in the cell environment. And what I produce along the way as I'm writing at the speed of my writing is production ready, right? It's all in Markdown being rendered. I don't have to fuss with it. Other than proofreading, like, so for example, it's 8:55 in the morning and I'm making the last ditch effort to finish up the context and the updates for the lecture. That's at 9 a.m. I can save, commit, push, and run downstairs. And by 9 a.m. and I'm in front of the classroom, the students can load up the notebooks on their laptops and it looks good. And it's there. And I don't have to fight with anything. Jupyter is also this platform glue. As soon as I start using Jupyter, that means I can use GitHub nicely because it renders nicely and conveniently out of the box. So the world of version control opens up. Ooh, I can ditch this 11-page PDF hellscape and put it all in Markdown. This was actually really, really convenient because I made a bunch of changes to my syllabus over the summer while my TA was out on her internship. And when she came back in, it was like, oh, I need to review my changes with you. Oh, but I wasn't taking notes on them. But I was tracking my changes, right? So all I had to do was open up my diffs and review those diffs with her. And I'm saying all I had to do because that's at least a normative behavior and not, it's something that we're both very used to because it can be a demotivational phrase there. So the Markdown can go in there, so ditch text and PDF. Data files can also go in there because again, for the data files, I care about knowing if I've made a change so I can get rid of that change. And also nothing's over 100 megs, so it's not a bad thing. It works pretty well. Also the universe of project management tools that I'm already used to working with open up for this class. So I can use issues and I can use pull requests. So instead of being, for the past 2 years, I've been like my one-person dictator over this little ship of mine. This semester, we have a co-instructor who's teaching parallel sections using my materials, and between the two of us, we have 3 TAs, 2 of which are experienced with the materials, so I can use them for more things. So now all of a sudden, I've gone from 1 to 5. And so on Monday, before I left for this, because my first class that I teach is on Monday night, next week, I was frantically making like 30 different GitHub issues for them to work through this week. We're down to 15. I'm very excited for that. There's only a little bit to do to Sunday. So I can do more in workflow that I'm already used to. So I'm going to get back to this write once, teach anywhere kind of perspective I have, where notebooks have the flexibility to look like you're running a script, like you're running an idle, or you're running in a cell. Right? So no matter which platform you're teaching in, and I've taught in many, you can write a notebook that works for that. So now remember, I write my lectures in Jupyter that I literally print off, scroll over with a red colored pencil, and haul around with me in the room. I am live coding inside of PyCharm and building up a script from there. I am not in Jupyter or please no one ever just evaluate cells for 2 hours because you will hurt my body if I had to experience that. So this means I can write a lecture once in one notebook and almost bring it on. Give me an IDE to teach in, and I can use that lesson without a problem. So if someone is like, I need to bring you in to teach a workshop, but we use this thing, cool, bring it. I can use these materials for that. You do have to be intentional about how you create the materials, but it gives you the freedom to use Jupyter for what it can be in a kind of a publishing perspective, but teach, I should check my time, wherever you need to be, right? Without having to fuss and change as you go. Jupyter has this problem of looking very linear, very X to Y, very directional, but we know that coding is not that way. Coding is very iterative and very loops. I don't start, like, take a 30-line script. Which line of that script was the very first one that you wrote? Or you may have altered it, but right, if you sort of backtrack the history of that code, now the import statements may have remained the same, but after the import statements, like, you go back through and you kind of start with a chunk and you build prequels and sequels after that chunk. And you're building in circles and you're not building in a line. And so you're able to have that flexibility of showing how a script is built up in its natural environment. Okay, so what this does actually look like for me, again, I have a focus on trying to use things that are free, things that are out of the box work, all the defaults. If it's fancy, like I went through 3 laptops in just last summer because things kept going weird. So the idea of installing 500 widgets to make it a reasonable experience is just not something I'm willing to put up with. I did recently add a spell checker widget, but otherwise that is the sole thing that I have added on other than stock Jupyter. So what are the things that I make? I have Jupyter notebooks, a lot of them. I have lots of Markdown all over the place. I have GitHub repos, and I have stuff in the learning management system, which I will hereby then say LMS. So the new problem with this system is I've split things back up, right? So instead of, I was complaining first that like my context and my human words are split from my code words. And so I've fixed that with Jupyter, but now I've got content in the LMS and I've got content on GitHub. But it's still okay. It's a little bit fussy, but it's dealable. So where should it all live? And we're going to talk about that. So what does a lesson notebook look like? A rough outline is admin announcements, your essays due today or due tomorrow or whatever kind of stuff. An introduction to the topic like why do for loops exist in the world? Reference information like what is a small pattern? What does the rubric of a pattern look like for a for loop? Some small worked examples, again, tearing out as much as I can so it's just the most minimal version of each kind of core pattern so they can see how things go. So there's like 4 different kinds of loops you might want to do, and I have 4 very small but worked examples for each. And then the bigger chunk of class, so that's about the first hour of a 2-hour block. The final hour is usually one, as much as I can, real-looking world problem using data. Right. So these are library science, information science students, majority. Most of them not from STEM. So I have stripped out math from this class. The most we do is calculating a mean. So we're using data, real data, but mostly text and banging it around to answer a real research question. And we can do this in basically day 1 of actually coding because Python's so flexible. And so I will take them through, I start with the research question, I introduce the data, and then I step them through the problem solving of making that little script to solve that problem. And then some final conclusions at the end. And that's my notebook. And they diverge a little bit, but I have 14 of those. They're usually about 20 to 30 pages printed off, designed again for a 2-hour slot. These take me from an empty notebook to front of the classroom about 2 to 3 days to write. If I had to write these split between applications, add a day or 2 from that, because I can write so much more efficiently inside this platform where everything is executable. The big caveat about these notebooks is they're written for me as lecture notes, as a thing to be sort of read and not necessarily executed. I do have executable code in there. I use these as lecture notes, literally printed off for me. Much of the content is cleaned up for students to make it kind of readable. I've been gradually transforming them to kind of look and stink like a book chapter kind of experience. So here's what some of it looks like, right? So now the text is a little small. I don't intend for you to read the text on the right just to get a sense for how it looks. This is just pure Markdown in here, and that's a giant block of code in Markdown. The formatting in Markdown I use is headers, lists of various types, inline code, and code blocks, and that's it. I have sort of banned myself from using tables because if I'm using a table, I'm doing fact dumping on them, and I would rather introduce it in context. Fact dumping is not helpful. The only time I use it really is sort of like, here's some reference dumping that you'll want to use later. Don't try to read this right now. I use code blocks for pseudocode or basic rubrics, or when it's a small example that's not actually moving the solution forward. Right. It's all fine if you give me a block of code that's going to give me an error because you want me to see what an error looks like. But if I'm not really, really clear about that and a student executes it, then all hell breaks loose and I get the world's worst emails from them because they haven't caught it. So executable code, it will often look like this, which is very sort of console-like. So I have like human sentence, code, human sentence, code. Now, this does break the train of thought. Looking at my time here. This does break the train of thought of the student a little bit, and it can make it hard if they're kind of reading it to get the gist and they're not actively typing along with it. It's hard for them to know what the end game should look like. So that's when but the flexibility of the platform is you just slap the end game there and say like, and when you're done typing this all in, it should look like this and have this output. And I repeat results, and it's fine, right? Because these are meant to be sort of static documents and not workbooks. And I think it's okay to make that distinction. This really strongly matches how I present, right? So I type in a line, doing like the 3 steps to live coding, type in that line, talk about that line, type in the next one, talk about the next one. So each one of these little pairs might take about 5 minutes to actually get through presenting. More minimally, so what does it look like when I'm super time crunched for something, or if it's like a one-off and it's not worth trying to like write paragraphs? I will put the block of executable code in there, and then at the end, or beneath it, I will have just a list of the facts, things I want them to notice. So this is both useful for me as an instructor, because I will probably take 30 minutes to present that block of code up there and walk them through writing that in. And I will go then, once I've wrapped up on it, grab my notes and go through this line by line, reminding them and talking about each one of those individual things. This is also helpful for students after the fact because while this seems like a small example to a novice, there's a lot going on in here. And there's a lot of detail that, remember, they're still learning how to look at code. They're still learning, like, where do I put my eyeballs on code? And so there's details they will not pick up on, and that's why we highlight it. Like, that's why we teach them, right? These things. And so if we don't highlight them, we'll think like, well, why can't you see? Like, of course it's novel and interesting that there's like a slash there, and they're just like, it looks like Python. What do you want? I don't know. And that's, be explicit, right? And then I have like a small activity in here. And so this whole thing, that's like 45 minutes worth of a workshop right there. Okay, sometimes I do fun stuff. Emoji bar charts are my favorites in here. So this is some visualization of the raven. This is so different emojis for different words for each stanza. For example, on stanza 11, the word door appeared once and the word raven appeared 4 times. So this is fun data visualization you can do without fighting with Matplotlib, or you can kind of do in the standard library. So it's super fun with the poop emoji too. Just saying. Markdown files, giant syllabus. It's a totally reasonable way to track a giant block of text. Edits also have a timestamp, so if I ever get pushback from a student about a policy and when it was put in, I can say like, well, I committed that change in before the semester started, so I'm not sure why you thought that didn't exist. Or if my administration asks, like, in which semester, or cool, which semester did this appear? Like, when did you start having this policy? I can track the history and say, like, yep, I put it in then. You'll note I don't put everything in the public GitHub, like my cell phone number. I do not put in the public GitHub repository. I do keep that in the lockdown LMS, and that allows me to take that gatekeeping of the LMS to just our students into a feature rather than a problem in there. Okay, so I keep one repository per semester, so students have one link to bookmark. I do need to clean things up, so I've sort of got an explosive number of files in there now. Once the semester's over, though, I stop making changes, and that's important because students will reuse these. I've had several students that just after one semester with me get Python-oriented internships, and I ran into a student in the hallway who was saying that she was going back to she had never coded before and got a Python internship, and was going back on multiple times a week to her lecture notes for that semester to refresh and review on what was going on. And if I had been changing them underfoot, the information she needed wouldn't be there anymore, or I'd have been in a different place. So they will reuse it, and it's important to kind of keep these artifacts. But you can also sort of diff and see how things have evolved over time. Now the question that I'm currently wrangling with is import versus fork. I have been importing because I didn't want to be limited to how many times I could import, and it has turned off that I don't need it more than once. And the disadvantage of import means you can't just pull in the previous changes. And so particularly at transition from fall to spring, there's a lot of overlap of developing. And if you actually wait till like, okay, my last lecture is delivered now I'm gonna panic develop the spring, is not hot. Because there's like 1 or 2 weeks of actual work time. And so dealing with this kind of concurrent development can be a little bit rough. Also, if I'm making policy changes for the next semester and I write those before the first semester stopped, I don't want to put that in the current fall semester syllabus. I want to put it in the next one. Okay, so transparent feedback is also really important to me. So during lab time, students can come in and say like, for that lecture, for that example, it would have been really helpful if you said X first instead of last. And I can say, cool, let me open up a GitHub issue around that. We do have a private repository with solutions, their code, their text. It makes sense to track it in GitHub. We use it for all semesters, so I can kind of see how things have changed. In the learning management system, I've got assignment things and the lockdown content, and in the GitHub, I have all the public things. And you're probably thinking like, well, the reading lists could probably be public. And you're right, but it's easier and less fussy for the students to have all of the assignment stuff in one place. They are in their comfort zone in the LMS. All of their assignments are listed there. So I don't want to split those up under this sort of arbitrary distinction of public versus lockdown. Coordination is still hard, but I'd rather have transparent coordination with timestamps than completely opaque coordination. That's also still hard. The various problems we've had with this is the solution files got committed in once. The Jupyter diffs sort of at least stock out of the box inside of GitHub, need more chill. Tons of PRs, it's really hard to work through because, yeah, we need to work on that kind of communication and etiquette inside of our own team. And I definitely blew away a lot of changes my TA made when I deleted the repository because I misread the timestamps. But we had a backup for the stuff we really needed, so that worked. Setting up for a new semester, you import or fork it, change names and dates, and you're kind of done, right? And then you can start working away at the new content for that next semester. Secondary benefits for students, I like to go with exposure for comfort and then dial in the novelty of actually doing the thing. I think it's really important, sort of this I do stuff with makerspaces, and I think the makerspace osmosis factor of just listening to people talk shop for a year about something, about 3D printing, for example, is really helpful then when you want to do your first 3D printing. So while they're not directly using GitHub, they are navigating to GitHub to get their materials. So they're learning what the interface looks like. They're starting to see the lingo in context. They see me commit and push in class and me talking about it. The same thing for Jupyter. They get to see the notebooks. They read them. They're not executing them, but they're reading them. Some will actually fork it and start using the notebooks themselves. And then they will some of them will use Jupyter totally without any transitional problems at the end for their final projects. And I find that I don't have to I say oh yeah, it's Shift-Enter, sorry about that, is the most I have to explain. And they've kind of figured it out on their own because they've seen and read mine for 14 weeks. Secondary benefits for my instruction team. My summer TA submitted her first pull request in her very first week with me. Cool in the 5 minutes. We all learn as we go, so we can experiment and learn together in our comfort zones. We get valuable practice as a team for getting team coordination. So in summary, Jupyter Notebooks allow instructors to create really flexible content to be taught in multiple contexts, multiple platforms. It opens up a really clean way to migrate your course content into a repository to allow for a lot of different remixing. It sets up future runs really, really well because it brings that context of the authorship history in. So for example, like, I need more context for this example that you clearly wrote and committed in here last year. Timestamps and other edits are really transparent to students, and that's really, really important to me. I don't want you to feel heard, just heard. I want you to feel like I take action and care about your feedback. So my calls, not calls to action because only you know your context for action. These are my calls for you to consider. So consider using platforms like Jupyter Notebooks to write your lessons, despite if you are not even teaching in Jupyter. And question sometimes if Jupyter is the right platform to teach in for the thing that you're doing there. Match your notebook content style to the style of interface that you're teaching inside of. Migrate as many text documents as you can into Markdown. If it just has text for me, I just put it in a Markdown document because it's easier. Keep your previous runs protected so students can reuse them and you can archive them later on as well. And really do take the time to train up your instruction team so that everyone can learn. So if you are curious and want to see the drama show of the fall semester getting wrangled up, it's there. This is the 4th repository I've run now. This is my 5th semester teaching this class. This slide deck's DOI is there, and you can hit that URL to download it, and that's what I've got. Questions? And if we can't get to your question, feel free to ask me whatever you want afterwards. I can talk about this stuff all day long, so bring it. Questions? We have some time for questions. Did I answer all of them? Probably not. Bring it, come on.
So they're not even using GitHub graphical user interface, right?
They don't, so if they do a final project with code, if the programming project, they are required to use it, but I teach them how to use GitHub Desktop. Yeah, I have very strong opinions about that. But most of them, they have like a little hour-long workshop that's written in Markdown, and I do in a lab session, and that's totally enough, and most of them teach it themselves, to themselves as they go. So, Jason, yeah.
I guess students coming to you with the expectation that they want to learn coding, that's why they're there.
Mm-hmm.
Do they have feedback about the notebooks and GitHub and all these things in contrast to other courses they've taken? I don't know, what's your sense of,
Yeah.
once they've taken your course, do you have any sense of how that changes their expectation of other courses?
I've had a variety of feedback along those lines. So I've had students who are concurrently in classes using Jupyter, and they really liked mine better as their very first exposure because they just sort of, the cellness was, and the eating your own tail sometimes was kicking them in the butt. I've had students who I super inspired to divert their entire program to be a technical program, take later technical classes, and they would come to me for help with those classes. So one of their projects, I have a lot of research projects for like writing and essays. One of the essays they have to do is investigate 5 different platforms and IDEs for programming in Python, and I do require Jupyter for that as one of them. And a lot of them do. Like it can go either way. I've had some students just like, no, what is this cell thing? I am not engaging with that. And others going like, yeah, that's really cool. I really like it. And it's usually like no one's really indifferent towards it. Everyone's like either like, this is awesome, or like, what is this? No. So. Sure.
When they're exposed to PyCharm, are there any hiccups or
Yeah.
like training or what?
So I like PyCharm Education Edition because it's quiet. Because even though the little prompts that have gray in it, we know are like, it's gray. You're clearly not yelling at me about anything today. We know that because we know that contextually. But they're like, it's telling me about PEP 8. And I don't understand, and I can't do my homework because it's telling me I'm not doing PEP 8 things. And I'm like, It's fine. You're going to be fine. I like it because it's quiet and there's the big green button. And they run it and they click it and it appears. There is a problem with if they're using input to type in inputs and getting in inputs from users, the cursor doesn't appear next to it and I have to walk them through that. The fact that it ends every successful run completed with error code 0 horrifies them. And I have to take about 10 minutes in class to say, you want this to see. They see the word error and they don't read further. They're just like, it's not working and I can't make it work. And I'm like, it's fine. It's fine. It's going to be fine. So, but once they get through that, they really like it. And I do offer that. I tell them, you can use whatever you want. This is the one you're going to see me using. And most of them, I've never had anyone do anything else. But in class, they have their laptops open with PyCharm doing the thing. There have been a few. I do have cloud options for everything, and I work with students one-on-one if they need to for other stuff.
Break time.
Cool, break time. So thank you.